Much of what we were talking about, specifically, I think, for the two of you, is from a Medicaid perspective. What should any state or Part C person at a let's say an upper level within their management system know when approaching Medicaid?
I think one thing to think about when you're first approaching a Medicaid agency, if you're looking to increase your funding for your early intervention program, is to establish relationships. I think that is essential. In Virginia, we were really lucky to have a very positive working relationship with someone at the Medicaid agency who was really dedicated to early childhood health and related issues, and was very interested in the early intervention program. So that, I think that was a huge part of what made our program successful. And I also think be prepared when you go, and be prepared with some information about how you expect to long-term save the Medicaid program money. Because we all know that if you provide services early, you're going to save money down the road, and it improves the quality of a child and family's lifelong trajectory.
Did you already have a relationship with the individuals in Medicaid because of your own background? Or Kyla, did you have relationships with these people before you got into serious discussions about what you wanted to do?
Well, I think one of the nice things in Virginia is that our Code of Virginia establishes the state Medicaid agency as one of the participating agencies in Part C early intervention, and did from the get-go. So they were always engaged in this work in general, and they were active participants as well on our state interagency coordinating council. So we had a broad relationship around early intervention in general, as well as specific relationship with an individual within that agency, as Catherine mentioned, that was specifically interested and engaged around early childhood and early intervention.
Where did you start in terms of yield, in terms of Medicaid participation through the program? And kind of where did you end, and where did you end relative to the leadership that the two of you have provided to the program?
Well, so it does go back a really long ways. And actually it goes back before Part H. We did have early intervention infant programs across Virginia prior to the federal legislation. And Medicaid did pay for OT, PT, and speech provided through private agencies, as well as through some of our what are now some of our local lead agencies, our community services boards, through outpatient rehab. And so we were not unfamiliar to Medicaid even before sort of the structure under the federal legislation came about. And so, yeah, I mean, it's back to Ann Lucas had really around that Code of Virginia work and our participating state agencies. We had a state, outside of the Interagency Coordinating Council, we had a state kind of working group with representatives of each agency. And there was an individual high in the state Medicaid agency who had a very close working relationship with Ann, our Part C coordinator at that time. They actually, their agency hosted those routine meetings, and she was very involved. We worked hard to have an interagency kind of presence around monitoring and problem solving at the local level. So even if it wasn't a Medicaid specific issue, this individual was a part of the team that would help do problem solving around broader early intervention issues. And then, you know, as we moved along, there was a point in 2007-ish, 2008, where we were struggling a bit in Virginia around financing and having enough and having it be sustainable, and hired some national consultants to help us analyze our financial structure and identify some opportunities for new or expanded revenue sources. And that was the point at which we really started talking about expanding Medicaid's reimbursement of early intervention services, both in terms of the number of services that they reimbursed and the rates at which they reimbursed those. And so those national consultants helped facilitate some conversations between, again, some folks at the state Medicaid agency who were already engaged with early intervention, but now specifically around this issue of expanding their support of the program.
And so when the program came online at its beginning point, was it based on a fee-for-service model and around a specific disciplinary representation, meaning OTPT speech as opposed to a home visit that any of those those individuals, and because they are appropriately credentialed, or others could do?
So we did originally have it as a fee-for-service model based on the provider of the service. And when we were able to expand our Medicaid early intervention program, take it out of outpatient rehab, and establish what we did call an early intervention Medicaid program, it was fee-for-service based on your discipline type. So OT, PT, speech, nursing had a higher reimbursement rate than did some of the other, less traditional provider types. So we were able to get Medicaid to reimburse for what we call developmental services, others know as special instruction. So some of those provider types, as well as social work, psychology, paraprofessional delivery of services, had a lower reimbursement rate, but it was based on the service. It's based on 15-minute units of service. And we were also able to, a couple of years later, establish a specific early intervention case management program under Medicaid. And that part is based on a monthly rate.
And what would you say if someone's coming to you to say, what would you encourage us to do? What would you encourage them to do in terms of the model? And embedded within that question is, who does your billing? And do the individual providers bill and chase, or does the state do some centralized billing and pay and chase?
Well, certainly, so we established it as fee-for-service. Within the last couple of years, it has moved into managed care. That has been a real challenge. And so we would definitely recommend the fee-for-service approach, if at all possible. Everything under fee-for-service went directly through the state Medicaid agency, as opposed to now having to go through 6 or 7 managed care entities, all of whom do things a bit differently. Our billing in Virginia is done at the local level. So, and it's a little different in different local systems. In most cases, the provider agency does the billing. We do have a couple of local systems who have their own sort of centralized billing for all of their providers through the local lead agency or a contract out to a billing agency. So they bill and chase. And some are better at that than others.
And what's the experience been in terms of your yields, in terms of what you initially had projected, either both for Medicaid and private insurance revenues? And again, put this in some context of, let's say, the last 5 years or the last 7 years, something like that, not to go back as far back as sort of the beginning.
The revenue that Virginia received from the state, from Medicaid reimbursement, has really sustained our system. We would not be in compliance with federal rules and regulations without the funding that we receive. We've also been very lucky that the state match, which in Virginia is 50%, comes from the state Medicaid agency. So that does not come out of our Part C state money or a federal grant. Well, and it couldn't come out of a federal grant, but we, so that's been very fortunate. So that's, really helped us with our funding our system and sustaining it. I don't know where we'd be if we didn't have that significant amount of money. The private insurance is not as significant, but it certainly makes a difference. And often it's a little harder to be reimbursed for that. But it's not an insignificant amount of money that we get each year for private insurance reimbursement.
And are you talking in the hundreds of thousands of dollars or low millions of dollars? Or
I don't have this year's figures, but the private insurance is in the low millions.
great.
Yes.
And Medicaid?
Is over 20 million.
Great. That's really good to hear.
And so half of that is, state share from Medicaid, and then they obtain the federal share from Medicaid. So
As you were implementing more, I would say in the last 5 to 7 years, as opposed to going back to the beginning of claiming both from Medicaid or private insurance, what has been your general yield, which you've already answered, but yield as it relates to what assistance do you provide to providers, both initially for implementation, although that might have been covered a number of years ago, but ongoing maintenance costs if they're the ones either who are doing the billing or contracting out for someone else to bill for them?
Well, I think when Medicaid was fee for service, I think folks would have said it was not overly cumbersome to bill and chase Medicaid.
Mm-hmm.
Since moving to managed care, it's a very different experience. And we do hear a lot about the administrative burden on local folks to bill and chase. And there's always been some comments around that as far as private insurance goes, for many of the same reasons that managed care is a bigger challenge than fee for service. So our local systems get an annual allocation of funds, part of which can be used for administrative kinds of costs and system management costs. So that some local systems do choose to use some of their money towards that. That varies across the state. Some of our private providers do other billing and have other billing folks who tend to maybe be a bit more comfortable and well-versed with billing and chasing than do some of our public agencies who might be our local lead agencies. So it varies, and we have had those who have done either contracted out to a billing agency or the local lead agency bills for all of their providers. I think the general sense has been that they have realized the benefits of a professional doing that work and doing it for a larger number of people, as opposed to each agency trying to do that for themselves.
And I'm assuming with your managed care organizations that you're discussing, by and large, you're talking about those as Medicaid funded managed care organizations. So even though Medicaid's paying it, Medicaid does not require them, if you will, to pay it. And I know historically there was and probably still is a significant amount of self-insured plans and or companies that will not pay. Or is that your experience presently, that for either Medicaid for the managed care people or for private insurance that will people not pay and expect that you need to make that up with your state funds or your Part C funds? I don't know if you can weave that into the question, but.
For one thing, there are a couple of things that, even though the managed care strategy has been a little more difficult than fee for service, to put it mildly, there are some protections that the state Medicaid agency put in to make it so. For one, the IFSP is the prior authorization for the service. Mm-hmm. And so that managed care entities are not supposed to alter that or change that. They're just supposed to accept it. Originally, they accepted all of our providers as Medicaid providers. And and they were not allowed to lower the rates when this started. So those were very positive things. And yes, there are some private companies that will not cover early intervention. And although I haven't really heard that much about that recently, more the discussions about the MCOs.
Yeah. What's the percentage of your statewide population relative to insurance status between either Medicaid, private insurance, and uninsured?
We don't have exact data on this, but we're getting a new data system and hope to be more reliable in the future. But about half of our children are Medicaid. I don't really have a percentage for private insurance.
Yeah.
Do you?
I do not either.
Yeah. I would bet based on Affordable Care Act, most of those kids do have some coverage. Certainly some. I know Massachusetts had about 2%, 2 to 3% who were uninsured. And that's where just regular old state appropriation funds were used to do that. And or the very small number of families that said, we don't want you using our Medicaid benefit. And that was one of those. I know you guys have heard my rap on that ad nauseum of, well, it's of no problem to you, you know, it's helpful to have more kids be served. But on the private insurance side, I think it's, we've always affirmed we will not do it if they object to having it be done. But at the same time, it is I guess, a discussion point to say, the more we have to fund people out of general appropriation, then in most cases, fewer kids are going to get served because that money gets eaten quicker when there is a payer that theoretically could pay.
We are very lucky in Virginia that we do have an early intervention mandate, but again, it only applies to insurance companies that are, you know, located in Virginia.
Right.
And we also have an autism coverage mandate.
Yeah.
Of course, the minimum amounts don't begin to cover what it's likely going to cost, but there is.
Right. Yeah.
Did you want to know anything about which authority you should use for getting coverage through the Medicaid?
I think that would be great.
In Virginia, the early intervention benefit is covered through the early periodic screening, diagnosis, and testing option, which I think is a good route to go because there are other requirements that go along with that for, like, in other words, this would apply in general anyway, but basically even if a state doesn't cover a service, if a child needs that service and it's ordered by a physician, a licensed practitioner, the Medicaid agency has to provide that service. And they do have some, it has to be a Medicaid eligible service, but so there's some protections built into that. Although I think some states covered under the rehab benefit, although you could argue that these services technically aren't rehab. They're
right.
So I think that's probably been the best. I think that's a good approach, is to use the EPSDT authority.
On claims, I think you mentioned there were claims that went to either private insurers or Medicaid where the claims weren't honored. And my question is, do you have someone in the office or with other people that you contract with who chase for claims where it appears there's nothing wrong with the claim that was submitted? There might have been a transposed number around discipline or something of that nature. Do you have any kind of, I want to say, aggressive follow-up, not in a heavy-handed way, but it's not about what the provider did. It's really about, like, the payer needs to pay this. It should be a clean claim.
In Virginia, we don't at the state level have anyone that does that. That usually happens at the local level. Virginia being a commonwealth has a lot of local autonomy. And so that happens at the local level. And you're right, I think programs that do have that are able to, you know, recoup the more benefits and funding than others. So, and I think it's definitely something that is a value.
And I assume part of that is also relative to who was billing, who has had historic billing before and really knows what they're doing, and how to say, no, I'm not going to accept this as a rejection because I can see this should have been paid. Okay, so what am I not asking you that you would like to speak to?
Well, I wondered, I mean, Catherine mentioned earlier, you know, that Medicaid, one of the sort of arguments when you're talking with Medicaid about what's in it for them is the cost savings down the the line, I wondered if it would be helpful if we talked a little bit about some of the other things that at least our state Medicaid agency was interested in or was appealing to them that they would get out of this expanded program.
Yeah, well, I think that would be ideal if people are talking about here's what the benefit is.
Yeah, yeah. So in Virginia, as we talked with our state Medicaid agency about expanding coverage for early intervention and really talked about how it would help early intervention, but also talked about, what might benefit the state Medicaid agency or what we could do to help make this a more attractive proposal. There were a number of things that we identified and that helped move things along. One of which was that there was some thought that it was mutually beneficial in terms of child find on both ends of the deal.
Right.
That, the state Medicaid agency may identify in their data system, because our kids were now going to be flagged as being part of this early intervention Medicaid program, that if they were seeing children under 3 who were getting OT, PT, speech kinds of services and didn't have our indicator on them, that those referrals could come to us. And likewise, they felt like more of their children who were covered by Medicaid, they could be ensuring and seeing in the database that they were getting the needed services.
Right.
And
I think the really positive thing of what you said is that coverage under Medicaid goes well beyond early intervention. So that was always a selling point to say, this is where a lot of your costs are going to come from in terms of this population. And it's not just for their children in terms of issues of sort of health equity and what people need to be working on as well.
Right. They were also interested in how this might help them have some more data around some health status indicators that were important to them, particularly around immunizations and well-child visits. Mm-hmm. And we agreed as part of this program that our service coordinators would send every 6 months to the primary care physician a set of questions that we agreed upon with the state Medicaid agency. I think there are 6, maybe 7 of them around those topics about when they last had a well-child checkup, when their next one was coming, how they were in terms of their immunization status, so that our service coordinators could help make sure families followed up and the state Medicaid agency would have access to that kind of data if they wanted to use it. So that was another little caveat that helped kind of push it forward. There were some things around providers where the state Medicaid agency felt like this program was going to help them to know better who the providers of these services were in our state and where they were. And that if they could potentially see where there were gaps in service coverage in parts of Virginia, which helped us as well as them, of course. And one of the things that we did around those non-traditional providers and getting them to cover special instruction and social work and so forth was to agree that we would institute at our state lead agency an EI certification process, so that they were assured that not only did these folks meet their discipline-specific requirements and criteria, but also that they had demonstrated their knowledge and skill in the area specifically of early intervention. And so we did put into place a process where all of the providers, not just educators and social workers and those folks, but all of them apply to us, complete a series of online training courses in order to be certified. And a big part of that was as an assurance to the state Medicaid agency that these were highly qualified service providers.
That's terrific.
And then I think the other thing that we agreed to that I think was helpful was we agreed to do the quality management reviews, the Medicaid quality management reviews for the early intervention program, the Medicaid early intervention program. So this was obviously by making this expansion going to mean there were a lot more providers that needed to be have those quality management reviews, and a lot more services that needed to be covered under those QMRs. And so we agreed that we could integrate that within our monitoring system. There were some benefits for us as well, obviously, and that we could take that on as opposed to asking them to also add that to their plate.